Are we okay? Good evening, friends. My name is A.R.R.M. Arun, and I am the President of the Southern India Chamber of Commerce and Industry, SICI. On behalf of SICI, I would like to extend a warm welcome to each of you to today's important program. Important for one is with the ongoing pandemic, we are extremely glad to have a person of Dr. Soumya Swaminathan's eminence join us today and discuss with us. Secondly, it's also the launch of our SICI 360 series that we have just started. We are extremely glad that Dr. Swaminathan has given us today's date for the launch of this program, today being auspicious for most of us, and today being the start of Navaratri. Let me take this opportunity to wish Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, each one of you joining us today, as well as your family, a very happy Navaratri. The Southern India Chamber of Commerce and Industry, as most of you would be aware, has just completed 110 years of service to industry, government, and society. During this time, we have conducted several programs, events, and seminars, during which we have invited several speakers to visit us, join us, and share their expertise with us. Invariably, these speakers have spoken about their area of expertise and not gone beyond. We, however, felt that our speakers have much more to offer than just their area of expertise. That is how we came up with the concept of SICI 360. SICI 360 is a new foray for SICI away from the regular format of our seminars. Before I continue with the rest of my current slide, let me draw your attention to the two individuals mentioned below, two of our executives. In case any of you have any problem in connecting at a later time, if you face a dropped call and have difficulty connecting, please feel free to give these two executives a call and they'll be able to assist you. As I was saying, SICI 360 is a new foray for SICI, away from the name itself. We wanted to come up with something catchy that depicts a multidimensional perspective and not just on one area. We hope that this will be a lively discussion with our eminent guests. Again, guests who are experts in their respective fields, who will be able to share with us their all-round path to excellence. We also look forward to our guests' inputs for our next generations, as well as for the benefit of society. The format that we will be following during SICI 360 is we will be having a flow of 5 sections, a brief about the guest's expertise, the organization they work for and their role. Third is a few points about their career development. Fourth is their inputs to the next generation. And last of all, their inputs to society. We certainly encourage our audience to participate with us. Please feel free to share your questions to the host or the co-host, and we'll be glad to have it mentioned during the course of the program. There are 2 guidelines that we are following during these programs. The first is we want to make our guests at comfort at all points of time. And secondly, we would like our audience to be able to gain by participating in such programs. These are the 2 guidelines that we are following for SICI 360. As our well-known Tamil scholar, Dr. Devaki Muthaiah has said, a daughter of Tamil Nadu. A daughter of Tamil Nadu being appointed to such an eminent position of a global organization certainly makes each one of us extremely glad. As most of you would be aware, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan is the daughter of Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, who is known as the founder of India's Green Revolution, as well as Mrs. Meena Swaminathan, a noted educationist. I'm extremely glad to receive an email yesterday from Dr. M.S. Swaminathan. He wished us the best for today's program as well as for SICI going forward. We are extremely glad to have received his email. Dr. Soumya Swaminathan this is the first time that an Indian doctor has been appointed Chief Scientist of the WHO. She was earlier the Deputy Director General of Programs and holds the top post as an Indian in WHO so far, and currently second in command. Her prior stint included being the Director General of ICMR and is well known for her research on tuberculosis as well as HIV. She studied at Delhi's AIIMS and Pune's AFMC. We in fact are glad that we have our alma mater from AFMC, the faculty as well as the students joining us today. Dr. Swaminathan later trained in the UK and USA. She was also part of the committee that drafted the surrogacy bill that ended commercial surrogacy in our country. With that brief intro, I'm again extremely glad to welcome Dr. Swaminathan to today's program. Dr. Swaminathan, வணக்கம், எப்படி இருக்கிறீங்க?
Arun, and
yes.
Greetings and thank you so much for your very kind introduction.
It must be 12:30 in Geneva right now, Dr. Swaminathan. We hope we've not disturbed your lunch.
No, it's fine. Perfectly fine.
So as I was saying, the discussion is going to be surrounding 5 topics. So the first one is your area of expertise, which we would like to say as COVID to start with. Being in the forefront of the fight against COVID, we are sure our audience today would like to hear from you as to what our current situation, in your opinion, is, as well as, more importantly, going forward. Can we request your brief opening comments on this?
Okay, sure. I mean, this is obviously not such an easy topic to summarize very quickly because you could get into a lot of details. But maybe, taking a bigger view, what we see today is that the pandemic is actually accelerating. The speed at which, the rate at which it's growing is even faster than we've seen in the last few months. So currently we are adding something like 300 to 350,000 new infections a day, which means that every 3 days we're adding 1 million new cases. And unfortunately, the death toll has also crossed 1.1 million. And somewhere between 5,000 to 6,000 people globally are dying of this disease. Now, both of these numbers are underestimates. The number of infections, instead of 38 or 39 million, is at least 10 times higher, maybe 20 times higher. We think maybe about 10% of the world's population may have been exposed and infected. As far as deaths are concerned, countries that have good records have been able to report the number of excess deaths over and above the known COVID deaths. Not all of those excess deaths are going to be COVID, but a significant proportion could be. In India, we don't have a good death reporting system. So this is a gap that needs to be filled. It's important not only for COVID and other outbreak diseases, but generally to focus policy, you need to understand, you need to have a medical cause of death reported for each death that happens. And in India, it's only 20% or so of deaths which have that. So across the world, we see different patterns. We've seen countries which have initially controlled it very well and then have managed to keep it like really either zero or very close to zero with occasional clusters. Most of these countries are in the Southeast Asia region, China itself, but also South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Hong Kong. They have very good public health system to really come down and be able to track and close down clusters before they become too big. So extensive diagnostic capacity they have developed over a period of time, a very good public health work infrastructure and a workforce that works like very efficiently. And of course, they also have people's cooperation. So if you look at mask wearing, I think the highest rates of universal mask wearing is in these countries. And I'm sure that that's playing a big role. The other set of countries are those like in Europe, which actually went through a peak. They were able to bring down through quite stringent measures that they had taken over the summer. And then as their economies, what is being described as a second wave with the daily case detection is actually much higher than what was in March and April. But that's again because of diagnostic testing capacities having improved. And Europe is worried now because heading into winter, with more of indoor events, they feel that this transmission could increase. And then the third set of countries are those where I think India also falls into this category: Brazil, Russia, other large countries, United States, where the epidemic has continued to grow, though different parts of the country may be affected at different time points. So you see ups and downs a little bit, but essentially it's been, on the rise. And it's because of the huge population for one, and the geographic diversity and so on. Africa has been a bit of a paradox in that it has not gone to the levels that were predicted. Very dire situations were predicted for Africa, with thousands of people dying. That hasn't happened, and we can come to that later. So looking ahead, what is it? I think that's more important. We know the pandemic is here to stay. We know that there are no magic bullets or silver bullets that are overnight going to change the situation. We can be hopeful that there will be vaccines from the middle of next year, but they will be limited supplies. They will only go to the very high risk people, probably the frontline workers and the healthcare workers, followed by the elderly. We're still at least 2 years away from the entire population being able to get a vaccine. So till then, what is important is that the measures which have been shown to work, I think what's important is to understand what works, because people often give up saying that nothing can be done. And it's not true. A lot can be done. We know that keeping a distance works. Most of this transmission occurs by close contact. So transmission is another very hot topic that people get into all sorts of arguments about. But it's very simple. It's a spread through droplets. The larger droplets travel up to maximum of 6 feet. So that's why the 6 feet distance and the mask wearing. The small droplets, very small ones, can stay in the air for some period of time. They're sometimes called aerosols. And if you're in a closed, small space with plenty of people, somebody infected who's been talking or laughing or singing, those small particles can infect you even if you're maintaining a distance of over 6 feet. So that's aerosol transmission, which has been documented to occur in some settings, but that's not the major mode of transmission. So mask wearing, hand washing, respiratory hygiene, getting tested, staying away from people if you're infected, if you're a close contact, you need to be in quarantine, and maintaining distance, avoiding closed, crowded places. So we talk about the 3 C's. Avoiding the closed, unventilated spaces, indoor, crowded places like mass gatherings. Again, all the super spreader events have happened in places where a lot of people have gathered, more commonly indoor, but could happen outdoor as well. And the third is close physical contact. So the 3 C's, this is what Japan did. And then the fourth is maybe the C you can say is a clusters, identifying and making sure that you're shutting down clusters before they start spreading into the community. That's what we need to keep doing. So the responsibility is for governments and for citizens to do this for the foreseeable future. But I would say we should plan ourselves, be mentally prepared for another 2 years of disciplined behavior as a vaccine gets scaled up. And of course, I haven't said that there's a big if before the vaccines, because we haven't seen phase 3 results from any of the clinical trials of vaccines which are currently being tested. But I think we can be optimistic that there will be a couple of vaccines. So maybe I'll stop there, Arun.
I appreciate the detailed insight. If you look at our country, for instance, in India, the recovery rate has been particularly high, perhaps 80% or maybe even slightly more than that. And perhaps that gives a sense of laxity in people, that they do not have to follow the required amount of precaution. A lot of people are also not thinking about the fact that after recovery, they have to face the after effects of the virus as well as the medicine. There's certainly also a lot of reinfection happening among the frontline workers, which was not seen during the earlier days. It's definitely not safe to let our guard down in any way. Any comments on this?
No, you're correct. We do not understand the immune system and how it's responding to this virus. We've understood a lot about the virus, where it spreads, how it spreads, etc. We know the genetics of the virus. There's been over 150,000 virus sequences now publicly available. But what we don't know is what it does inside the body. We don't know fully. And we're finding out from these long-term studies of people who've recovered. So even people who've had mild infection and recovered, they do have some persistent symptoms. And there are now studies going on, to see what are the effects on the heart, on the nervous system, on other parts, other organ systems. So you're absolutely right that even if you're young and healthy without any other illnesses, your risk is not zero. You could get the infection and you could get the after effects as well. And reinfections, again, is something we are learning. It's, I would say, still rare, but then we're only 9 months into the pandemic. Case reports are increasing of people getting infected the second time. So obviously some people do not get immunity after the first infection, and we don't know how long that immunity is going to last. So as we are understanding more, of course, our responses could be tailored and they could change. But till then, I think it is wise to be more safe than sorry.
Being a chamber like ours, Dr. Swaminathan, we have to the rate of transmission as well as getting the economy enabled. Now, if we look at transmission, as you've also rightfully said in the past, beyond, say, 30 minutes of exposure, if no physical distancing is followed, as well as no PPE or personal protective equipment is worn, then the rate of transmission definitely increases. So when we look at our offices, say it's perhaps difficult to be able to maintain such areas, and perhaps there are other work environments as well where we necessarily have to get things moving in order to be able to stay in business. So how do we balance this, in your opinion, between reducing the transmission as well as enabling the economy?
Yeah, I think this is a really critical question. We cannot shut down the economy, obviously, for the next 2 years. So I think what we have to do is we have to now apply everything that we know about this virus and take all the precautions and reduce the risk as much as possible. You may not reduce the risk to zero, but you should reduce the risk. And in offices, I think it's really good to have like standard operating procedures and make somebody in charge of it. One person should be responsible and to implement this. Like in hospital ICUs, they have one person. Very often it's a nurse who is responsible for the antibiotic policy of the hospital. Now, even the senior most doctor is supposed to listen to that nurse if she questions him, and he has to justify why he did certain things, why he gave an antibiotic. That authority needs to be given to that person. Similarly, I think for every, whether it's a industry, it's a factory, or it's some other kind of workspace area, you can do things to reduce the risk considerably. Have that open ventilation as much as possible. Have everybody wearing masks properly, not just dangling down, but masks have to be worn properly. Hand washing stations and disinfection stations, try to maintain the distance as much as possible. And now with the rapid antigen tests coming in, some businesses are thinking about having some kind of, that's still a strategy that needs to be discussed, how efficient and cost effective that is. But given what we know today, we can put in place measures to reduce the risk. And for people who are at very high risk, let's say somebody who has uncontrolled diabetes, or who's an older individual, or has underlying immunosuppressions, or a cancer patient, or a kidney transplant patient, these people really need to be kept away and protected. And at the same time, if we can support their livelihood, and if they could work from home or do some other function that doesn't require them to be in the office, then that, takes care of that person's livelihood, at the same time not exposing them to the risk. So it's a balance.
Not aware of the fact that 25 to 50% of the people testing are asymptomatic. And what that means is they are people who are infected with the virus and carrying it and can very well infect so many others around them. Is this global? Is the required awareness measures in place so that people can be well educated, in your opinion?
Yes, it is a global phenomenon. And some people have remain asymptomatic, which means that they don't even have any symptoms. They never know. But majority of them develop some symptoms after the... but it happens a day or two after they're actually infectious. So at the time that you are infectious, you may not actually have symptoms. So this is why we say that if everyone wears a mask, whether or not you're infectious, you have symptoms, it helps to a large extent to prevent the infectious particles actually from coming out and traveling out of your mouth into into the communal space. And the other thing is, if you have been in contact with somebody who's infectious, then you should self-isolate for 14 days, whether or not you have symptoms. That's the only way to cut the risks, the chances of transmission. And that's where also the cluster investigations would be helpful. The moment you find somebody who had attended a party who's positive, or somebody in the office, everyone around that person should be tested as quickly as possible. And that's where I said, with the rapid antigen test now, you can actually do that quite efficiently.
Our next question is on the vaccine, and this is from a student in Chennai. His name is Jaswant, and he's with XIME in Chennai. His question goes, quote, "We keep reading that there are several new strains of COVID virus. It was recently reported that Indonesia had a strain that was 10 times stronger. With a second wave coming in many countries, will the current vaccine in development be able to manage all the strains? Or like in the case of the RNA virus, will there have to be an annual change in vaccine?" In addition to this student's question, we also came to know yesterday that in Chile, there's supposed to be a new strain happening that is much more highly contagious compared to what was seen earlier.
Yes, all viruses mutate. So there are now about 10 known strains of this virus. You can divide them. Mutation happens as the virus divides, and it divides rapidly, multiplies rapidly. So there's, as I mentioned, there's a very good global database called GISAID, where many countries, over 100 countries, are depositing those sequences. There's a lot of analysis going on. What I can say is that so far, the virus has not mutated at the points which are of critical importance, like the spike protein against which the vaccines are being made. And also many of the drugs are targeting that particular receptor. So it hasn't impacted on treatment or on vaccine development. There are also no clear relationships between a particular strain and even though there's hypotheses all the time, even in India early on, a lot of people were saying we have a different strain, it's a mild strain, and that's why Indians are not getting sick. That has not been borne out. So there are different strains, yes. There are some mutations which tend to make the virus even replicate even faster, maybe more infectious. But you have to then look at epidemiology along with genetic sequence data. So what it needs is very well designed and good studies. It's not just casual observations, that will solve this problem. And I'm sure those studies are happening. We will learn more. But at the moment, it doesn't look like, it's not like the influenza virus, which mutates very, very rapidly and which needs a new strain of the vaccine every year. That is probably not going to be needed unless, of course, it changes. We are still only 9 months into the pandemic. So whatever we say today could change over the next few months as the virus, changes its pattern. But as of now, it's been quite stable.
By the time the vaccine comes out, is there a possibility that we would have reached herd immunity by then? And in that context, are traditional medicines like Ayurveda and Siddha, do you feel that they can perhaps be some kind of a silver bullet, especially considering how long a window we have before the vaccine is produced, which will effectively meet its purpose?
So the short answer to the first question is no, we cannot achieve herd immunity, and neither should we be trying to, because in the process, you will lose millions of lives. So it's a very high cost proposition. There's no infectious disease ever in the history of mankind which has been controlled by naturally acquired herd immunity. So the only way to acquire herd immunity is through a vaccine. Until then, you have to protect people and you cannot let the infection go through the community. So I think that message needs to be loud and clear. There's a group of people saying we should just let people get infected. Your ICMR study showed 7% of Indians have antibodies. So which means 93% are susceptible. If you want to get another 70% of Indians to get infected, first of all, it's not going to happen quickly. And secondly, you can do the math and calculate what the human cost will be. It'll be in several millions. The second point about Ayurveda, again, speculation alone is not enough. We know that Ayurveda has a lot of, not only a long tradition and a lot of accumulated knowledge, but many of the herbs that it uses and the remedies that it uses and the holistic approach is beneficial for health. Whether it is beneficial for COVID, either for prevention or for treatment, can only be established through well-conducted clinical studies, randomized clinical trials. And I think they've started a few, I believe. So we have to wait for that. The Chinese traditional medicine was also tested. I haven't really seen anything very dramatic come out of that, the early days of the epidemic in China. But so Ayurveda saying that as a whole, it's good for your system, it will boost your natural innate immunity. That is fine. But whether it's going to protect you from this virus or from any other disease, that's a different question. And that needs to be studied. So I think we must take a scientific approach to this. And it will be good, actually, if that data can be generated.
This is now the last question in our first section, Dr. Swaminathan. This is about public healthcare systems. We have been largely successful in contact tracing in India, and especially Tamil Nadu, whether it's in the tuberculosis or maybe even the HIV case. However, our COVID numbers are still on the rise. It will be interesting to know what further to be done. And in this context, we have Mr. N. Ram also joining us, who would like to say a few words on this subject. Mr. Ram, can we kindly request you to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Dr. Swaminathan, let me say I greatly appreciate, and I think many of us greatly appreciate, the clarity with which you have been imparting this information. The insights you offered over time have always been evidence-based, and I think it's extremely clear. I had the pleasure of hearing you, the recent Q&A for about nearly an hour, where I think many things are clarified. So let me first place that on record, that I think a lot of people, not only in India, but around the world, greatly appreciate the educational role that you played, apart from the other things you've been doing. That's the first thing. But on the comprehensive approach that WHO and you personally have been advocating, tirelessly, I would add, for individuals as well as for governments and public authorities. For example, test, trace, isolate, strengthen health systems. We talked about diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines. You already indicated your view on what is called this approach called focused protection. Go for naturally occurring herd immunity while protecting in a focused way the vulnerable. So I won't ask you about that. But on testing and contact tracing, there are huge variations across the world. And India, it appears to me, doesn't seem to be doing anything like enough, including in Tamil Nadu, testing. Some states, I think contact tracing is another matter. Some states do better than others. But for example, the figures I have suggest that in India, we have 800 for a million. That's the testing data, compared with other countries, developed countries, which have well over 2,000 or 2,500 and even 3,000, ignoring outliers like the UAE, which have huge numbers. So how important is, at this stage of development of the pandemic, is this component, test and contact trace contacts?
Yes, I think, as you say, Mr. Ram, the governments often tend to give up, I think, at a certain stage, because they feel that it's too much, the two numbers are too high, and it can't be done. But when you look at countries that have actually, girded up and said we're going to do it, they have succeeded. And that seems to have been the only way in which you could control, because you have to find where the virus is. You have to go after the virus. And of course, if you do it at a stage when it's still localized and in clusters, it's easier than when it's, community transmission. But I think looking at Tamil Nadu itself, there was a phase when things were really looking so bad. And a lot of even the public health people or people in government were really wondering whether anything could be done at all. But you can see over the last few months that the efforts have succeeded. That overall, not only are their total numbers coming down, but the test positivity rate, which is a very important marker. So if you're testing enough, as you mentioned, we have benchmarks of testing, and obviously we could do more, but our population is huge. So I think India's done well in terms of really being able to scale up from where we were in February, March to where we are today. Huge expansion of testing. We could do more. Have to look at a few other statistics, and one is the test positivity rate. And we had seen that consistently above 15% in Tamil Nadu. I understand now it's below 5%. Of course, then you go more granular, you have to go district by district. And then you look at bed capacity. That's what Europe is doing now. So they're looking at not just the total numbers, but their test positivity rate. And they're looking at their beds occupancy and their critical care bed occupancy. And that's how they're really tightening or loosening restrictions based on some of these parameters. So initially they saw in the summer in Europe a large number of young people getting infected. So it wasn't translating into that many hospital admissions or deaths. But then invariably, once the young are infected, the older will get infected, and then it does then start ending up with hospital admissions. So I think we should not give up on this testing and tracking, and really now maybe it's more of trying to identify those settings where maximum transmission is taking place, because you can't identify a person who's infected in the community, but you can identify the most high risk. So I saw an analysis that Paris had done to see where most of their transmission is occurring, and they found that it was occurring mostly in offices, in homes, and in restaurants and bars. So basically in either social gatherings or in official gatherings. It was not happening on the public transport. It was not happening in shops. So I think analysis of our data to identify which are those hot spots where we have to take more precautions. We saw the clusters happening in the big wholesale vegetable market, for example. That was a big wake-up call. And we've seen other clusters happen in
Coimbatore.
So,
Coimbatore, yes.
Yes, Coimbatore, exactly. There was the Coimbatore cluster. There have been a few other clusters related to cultural events and entertainment, and as well as religious gatherings. So those are the things that, absolutely need to be identified. But I think it's much easier for the government if they use the data they have to try to refine their approach, have it more targeted. And that perhaps needs to be strengthened. We have such good software expertise, such good mathematical expertise in our country. Somehow it hasn't been brought to bear on this, the discipline of data science, I think needs to be developed further, because that can really help the public health people as well as the political leadership to decide where to put resources. Because it's true that right now we're in a situation where things can seem to be at a point where you just can't cope. There's a tendency to then just give up. So that's where I think bringing data science in could actually help target resources.
Thank you, Dr. Swaminathan. Thank you, Mr. Ram. Before we head into the second section of today, let me inform you that we are glad to have Ms. Judith Raveen of the US Consul General in Chennai join us for this program as well. Dr. Swaminathan, in our second section about your role in the World Health Organization, perhaps we all know more about the WHO since the pandemic and know more about you as can you briefly tell us about your role as the Chief Scientist of WHO and how challenging and demanding is your role in strengthening WHO's core scientific work?
So I think looking back, probably it was very wise for the WHO and for the Director General to have created this science division in March of 2019. It was done basically for a couple of reasons. One was to strengthen further the normative work of the organization. We're a normative organization. We do norms and standards and guidelines and data. So it was to strengthen that and make sure that everything we do is of the highest standard, is quality assured. And the second important element was really to be able to have this function of foresight, to be able to be ahead of the curve in terms of the advances in science and technology and how we may leverage those for health, for medicine. And so we were focusing on these areas, including digital health and digital technologies and artificial intelligence and how those could be leveraged. The pandemic actually made us accelerate. So we went into a fast track mode. All of these processes took off. And so today we have a very rapid review process where we do evidence reviews to update our guidance based, because there's huge amounts of literature on COVID added every day. It's a real big job to sift through all of that and come up with consolidated recommendations. And then we are also now partnering with tech companies around the world, not only to use the tools more like we're doing now, but also to use it to tackle misinformation, which has been a big problem, I think, through the pandemic. It's become even more obvious that how social media can play not only a very positive role, but also negative role in amplifying rumors and misinformation campaigns. And so the tech companies have really worked with us to the extent that we can actually flag to them on a daily basis misleading information, and they remove it immediately, and they also direct people to the right sources of credible information. We've also expanded enormously our use of social media, whether it's chat bots or whether we have this WhatsApp groups in I don't know how many languages. We've launched training programs in over 40 languages. We have webinars. So we, in fact, coined the term the infodemic. So we've tried to address the infodemic along with the pandemic. And then on research, we've brought together scientists, researchers from all around the world. Who saw yesterday that we put out the interim results of the Solidarity trial of therapeutics, of drugs. We are planning in planning stages for the Solidarity vaccine trial that will have a similar global platform to test different vaccine candidates. So I think on the scientific side, we've seen tremendous, unprecedented kind of collaboration. So because of the unique role of WHO in being able to convene people from all the 194 countries that we work with, we are very quickly able to take the best to use that in an effective manner for the benefit of the world. So I would say those are the areas where I think the science division has played a big role in this pandemic. And we work side by side with our emergency program, very closely linked in order to do all of this.
Thank you, Dr. Swaminathan. The WHO has specifically recognized your research on tuberculosis and HIV. More specifically, you're being able to translate this research into impactful programs. Most often we face this paradox, whether it is research to people or whether it is policy to implementation or perhaps plan to execution. What has assisted you in this research to effective execution of your research? What's your advice to people in similar dilemmas?
I would say a couple of things. One is that you need to understand both sides of the picture, or all sides, because policy making, we always say policy making should be evidence-based, but political leaders, of course, should rely on the science, but they have other considerations as well. So policy making cannot be only based on, what the scientists or the researchers or the academics actually produce and provide. So it is a nuanced space. But I think one has to understand as a researcher, what are those other elements, other levers or other factors which could impact policy making, and you have to address that. So for me personally, I think the most important thing has been actually talking to people and listening to the community, the impacted community, and also talking to people who work with the community, like the NGOs and the community-based organizations, people who are really close to the ultimate end user, and of course the end users themselves, or in this case, TB patients themselves. So I've actually visited TB patients in practically every slum in Chennai. I know every slum in Chennai. So I know how people live and what the reality is of their lives. So that actually helps to put your research into context and to be able to put some value judgments on what is important and what is not important. So I think the communication is the other big skill. I think we scientists are not always very good at communicating our findings in a way that people can understand and can apply to themselves. So I would say it's not enough just to be a good scientist or a researcher or competent, but you need to have compassion and empathy for the topic and the people and the subjects that you're working for, and you need to have communication skills.
Thank you. We now get into the third section on career, and I'd like to start this section by asking a question that has been sent to us from AFMC. This is from Professor Saurabh Sen of the Department of Microbiology. And he says, quote, "Dear ma'am, what are your comments on the impact of the current pandemic on the tuberculosis eradication as well as other respiratory infections?" Unquote.
Yes, thank you, Saurav. And AFMC is my alma mater. So nice to see AFMCites here in this forum. Obviously, we saw that the pandemic had huge impacts on tuberculosis and other diseases, in terms of really impacting other health programs. We saw TB case notifications go down by 30 to 50%. I think at the peak of the lockdown, it was down by 70%, which is not surprising. That is, I'm told, it is recovering, getting back to normal, but I think it will have long-lasting impacts on TB and on other diseases, on as well things like cancer and mental health. I would say that we always used to talk about TB and mental health, but I think the COVID pandemic has also exacerbated the mental health crisis. It's put everyone into a state of anxiety, and people who already have depression and other forms of mental health illnesses are really impacted. So I think one thing we can learn, I think, from the pandemic is that we've been able to mobilize workforce to do this work of contact tracing in the communities. There are people who show up every day in your homes asking you whether you have a fever, taking your temperature, taking records, whether these are volunteer. So you can mobilize. We've shown that we can mobilize people. We've been able to ramp up diagnostics in a matter of 6 months. As I said, we've gone from, I think, having one lab in Pune at the NIV to 2,000 labs today, which of course includes the private sector. And it can go even higher. And we're doing, I think, 1.2 million tests a day. Why can't we do that for TB? We've mobilized the private sector to ramp up production of diagnostic reagents, and everything now is being, I think most of it is being manufactured in India, as well as the vaccines that are being developed in India, all in a matter of months. We have made Arogya Setu and other apps which can be used to help the public health people, both in messaging, communication, as well as in tracking patients and their contacts. Why can't all of this now be used for TB? So we don't consider TB to be a huge, but India is different. I think the world has neglected TB, but in India, there's been strong political commitment for TB. The Prime Minister has always talked about 2025 as the elimination date for TB ahead of the rest of the world, which is 2030. So I think if you have to do that in a time-bound manner, then you have to mobilize forces. And I think the way that the private sector has come together along with the government now is a good lesson for us to deal with some of our other huge public health problems like TB.
I'd like to ask my next two questions together, Dr. Swaminathan. So the first one is, you've been a practicing pediatrician and you've moved on to tuberculosis and HIV research. Now you are leading the global scientific fight against COVID. This has certainly been quite a journey. Was this planned, or did you have other ideas as well? And the second question is from another student. Her name is Sivayalini. She's doing her final year in SVC in Chennai. And she says, quote, Dr. Soumya, you make us proud. What is your future plan after your current role with WHO? Where do you go from here? Unquote.
Ideas are welcome. I don't know, but I would like to work with the community. I was always passionate about research, so I started my life as a researcher, and I spent most of my life as a researcher. Then I became partly policy maker when I became the head of the ICMR, and I could have some impact on research capacity building across our medical colleges. I got to see also the gaps in the translation between policy and actual implementation, and the huge variations in our country when you travel to different parts of the country and you see, the problems that people have. It all starts with the determinants of health. If you tell people who are living in a slum who do not have access to running water or to a toilet for that matter, to wash their hands regularly with soap and water when people have to walk miles to gather their water for the day, it's a little bit impractical. So that is when what I said earlier is always trying to implement your policies in a way that also, relate to people's realities. And so my travels across India, whenever possible, I was always going into villages to talk to people. The tendency is when we reach a certain level, we remain within our own circles. You sit in committee rooms and meeting rooms and you make policy. But whenever I had an opportunity, I used to go and I used to say that we need to really find out what people want and what they need. And in villages in Rajasthan, for example, their water was so full of fluoride. So their main health concern was fluoride. So you can go talk to them about TB or COVID or anything. But for them, the day-to-day problem is that they don't have quality drinking water, and they knew that it was impacting their health. So unless we solve that problem for them, they have no trust that you come there to do the right thing for you. So similarly in Javadu Hills, I once went long ago to talk to them about TB, and they said, that's not our problem. We hardly have TB here. Maybe once a year we hear of someone. But our problem is that if somebody gets a fracture in our village, we have no way of taking that person 13 kilometers by foot to the nearest primary healthcare center. So what are you doing about that? So those are kind of, wake up calls when they come to you. So my career was not planned. I had absolutely no intentions of coming to WHO. It was a surprise for me actually when the Director General invited me to be his director. I don't regret it at all because the experience I've had here has just been amazing. But probably the next phase of my career would be to use all this experience back into actually translating some of the benefits of science, into the community and addressing some of you mentioned Ayurveda, but the problem is in India now, the non-communicable disease burden is growing so high. Now we're all distracted by COVID. But the fact is that in Tamil Nadu, the biggest killer is not going to be COVID. It's going to be the diabetes and the hypertension, which is going to lead to cardiovascular disease or stroke. And even in our tribal areas, it is stroke which is the biggest killer. It's not malaria or TB. So this is something that only when you do the studies to find out, and you wonder why, because you think tribal people are living in a wonderful natural environment, in the middle of a forest. But it goes to show what, their risk factors for disease are. And how the determinants of health, including access to healthcare, can influence outcomes. So we need to actually go more upstream and not focus on building more hospitals, but on more preventive and promotive healthcare. Nutrition, diet, air pollution, addressing air pollution, water sanitation, And I would add mental health as one of the important determinants of health. So I think that's what I'd like to do in my next phase.
The passion for your work, Dr. Swaminathan, seems enormous. Whether it is taking underprivileged children in your own Maruti car in Chennai for treatment of their respiratory problems, or whether it is avoiding the AC comforts in Jodhpur and deciding to spend time on the field, getting to know the problem of rural women. What exactly drives Dr. Soumya and keeps her engaged as an active learner? Is it that you really love your field? Is it that you would like to make a difference to society? What drives you?
Yes, I think all of the above, Arun. As I said, I always had a passion for research from childhood. So that was something I grew up with. Maybe it was a family environment and so on. But also a great desire that work should translate into some good for somebody, not just be an academic exercise. So those are, I guess, the things that drive me. And then there are always, of course, questions for a scientific person. It is very exciting to have those unknowns that you need to answer. So you're always looking for a good scientific question that you want to address, but then that also gets linked to what's the impact actually on society, on communities. So I guess those are the two important things, and you already highlighted them.
Go to the next question. Glad to let you know that Dr. Ajit Yadav has joined us today. We appreciate his presence with us. And we also have perhaps close to 120 participants listening to our discussion now, Dr. Swaminathan, for your reference. My next question in this section is that have you had mentors, catalysts? Surely you must have. And have these people played a good role in guiding your journey, whom you would be grateful to?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that.
Did you have mentors, catalysts who have played a good role in guiding your journey to where you are and whom you are grateful to?
Yes, I've had a lot of mentors, of course, and I'm very lucky to have had those mentors. And one of the people that I really credit with the training that I got as a researcher is my mentor in Los Angeles when I went to do my fellowship. He's the one who really not only taught me the basics of research methodology, but also gave me the confidence to present my results in a scientific forum. At that time I was quite young and I had not presented in international fora, but he's the one who trained me to do that. And then when I was working in the Tuberculosis Research Center, I had an excellent director, Dr. Narayanan, who was a very good mentor to me. And he's the one who actually gave me confidence as a young researcher to go and present the work in front of a lot of policymakers in Delhi, to hold my own and to get me involved in those discussions. I mentioned about this at a conference last week. I think this was also picked up by the Hindu when I talked about the patriarchal nature of our institutions. And it's not just in India, I should say, it's everywhere globally. So as a young woman, you do face certain barriers as a young professional. You're not taken as seriously perhaps as a male counterpart. And especially if you're in a boardroom, in Delhi with a lot of older, more experienced men, then it becomes quite difficult and you could feel intimidated. So these are things that mentors really can help you with. And, if you feel at some point that you're not performing as well or you're down for some reason, having a mentor to be able to talk to, who understands and who can provide some guidance is always very helpful, I think, for at all ages and stages. I think you need that, but particularly when you're a young researcher and you're facing certain obstacles in your career, as everyone does, from time to time. And then, of course, having a supportive a family, particularly a partner. I think for a woman, it's extremely important, if you're professional, to have support so that you can focus on your career and not feel guilty all the time or not having to choose between. So I think that's an extremely important element. So our institutions are becoming a little more flexible. I think globally there's more recognition now that gender sensitive policies need to be made. But I think we're still a long way away from really having that equality or parity.
Glad to let you know, Dr. Swaminathan, that we now have 3 women as part of the SICKI Executive Committee. We've also been doing a lot of changes within us, and we feel that women also play a very important role in various walks of life. Having said that, I now move on to the next section, which is on the next generation. Your inputs for the next generation. You've come from a decorated family, your parents and their 3 daughters. How would you encourage parents to guide today's generation and also today's youngsters? As you've also rightfully said, it's important for them to be able to look up to parents and mentors and advisors so that they can get the right kind of advice. So I guess it goes 2 ways. It's not just one-way traffic where it's only people who have to be advised, but it's also the advisors who count a lot. So what is your advice to parents of these youngsters?
Parents of youngsters today.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I think youngsters today, are exposed to so much when they, because of the internet and the social media and so on, that they have a much wider view of the world and the opportunities and possibilities, I think, than we had. So it's difficult for parents, I think, to be able to appreciate the kind of career choices that young people today may be wanting to make. But I think that's where I think we need to be supportive, and we need to let them try and test out, their own interests and pursue their interests as far as possible. So I think as a society still tend to put a lot of pressure on children on academic performance, and we see that. In fact, there was an interesting statistic that this year there were less adolescent suicides, perhaps because there were no exams and there was no big, result that was coming out. So that's a sorry state of affairs, that a lot of teenagers commit suicide because they feel they have not met the expectations of their parents. So this is, I don't know, it's a societal change which needs to come about. The fact that the marks that you get in your exam is not the ultimate test of what you're going to be in life. And we need to be able to encourage young people to, to have their voice and to have a dialogue with them and not be telling them what they should be doing, and also comparing them with others. This is another thing we tend to do, is you compare with your neighbor's children and say, why can't you be as good as X or Y? So I think each child has his or her own potential. We have a huge problem, I think, of human capital in India, because a lot of kids today don't have the opportunities that could enable them to actually come up to their full potential. I, used to go to a slum near our house on the beach with the fishermen's children, and first of all, they're first generation learners. Secondly, they don't have role models. Their fathers are not role models for them. Their mothers are working all the time. And or even, so I used to talk to them, what do you want to be? So the boys would say policemen or IAS officers without knowing what that IAS would involve, or computers. They all said they want to be computer specialized. I said, what job are you going to do? They had no clue. The girls sometimes would say nurses or teachers and things like that. So there's absolutely no career counseling or any exposure to these kids. And I think that for the future of India, unless we focus on these kids, especially those who are in the less privileged sections and who are going to schools where they don't have opportunities, it's going to be hard to really, I think, become a developed nation. So the focus needs to be really on young people, on children in school, I think, both on the nutritional side, because many of them suffer from malnutrition, so the brain potential is not fulfilled cognitively, but also on the educational side, because their home environment may not be good. So somewhere we need to be able to find that space for them. And I think that's the big difference between, even within India, you see now 2 Indias, really.
This question is perhaps a light-hearted one, oriented towards the younger audiences that we have today. Having spent several years in Chennai, what do you miss in Chennai and Tamil Nadu, other than, of course, your family? And what's been your motivating places, arts, music, etc.?
So of course I miss family and friends. It was difficult, but at the same time, you know that it's a just temporary period, and then you're going to be back. And what keeps me going is, yes, music. I love all kinds of music, listening to music, going for walks. That way. Geneva is a nice place to go for walks. I love to be in the outdoors whenever I have time. So. Yeah, I think you should make the most of every opportunity and every place that you're in, knowing that it's not going to be lasting forever.
This brings us to the last section of today's discussion on your inputs for society. The first one is that this is certainly not going to be the last pandemic. I'm sure that we would have to be able to prepare for the future. And what's very important for this, as you've also mentioned, is the need for better health systems for prevention. It's also very important for us to be able to address any inequalities that we might have among the population. One very important component is fighting such pandemics is that of the primary healthcare system. It's something that's very important to do, and we're very glad that our esteemed past president, Dr. A.C. Muthaiah, is involved with such primary healthcare initiatives in southern Tamil Nadu, and I'd like to invite him to share a few words with you. Dr. A.C. Muthaiah, please go ahead.
Thank you, Varun. Dr. Swaminathan, I was really taken back with what you said, how to improve the society. I'm on the same wavelength as you are. Once Dr. Sanjeevi, you probably know him, he advised me and he too recommended me to start health clinics in the rural parts of India. He said, prevention is better than cure. So I started 15 health clinics in Sivaganga district, where we provide clean water, we build clean toilets, and in the health centers, we give minor ailments, we treat minor ailments, then we give nutrition mixes to the pregnant women and so on. Now, recently I read in the papers that these health clinics should do investigation on cancer, TB, etc. Now, what advice would you give me to improve these centers? Should we take up investigation on other diseases and so on?
Thank you, Mr. Muthaiah. Are these clinics manned by doctors or by nurses?
Doctors come. Doctors come once in 3 days. There's a visit by the doctors, and the clinics are manned by health workers, whom we train them in our nursing center here in the VHS.
So maybe I could make a few suggestions, and one of them is to do a sort of a health survey in those villages. Maybe you've already done that. That will sort of give an idea of what the major health problems are. And I would bet that the major health problems would be related to the non-communicable diseases. So if you went and screened everyone for high blood pressure and diabetes, a significant proportion of them, adults would have high blood pressure or diabetes. Then amongst the children, one needs to see what is the level of malnutrition. In fact, in some parts of Tamil Nadu, we are moving towards obesity actually, especially in adult women. And that's partly related, I think, to diet and so on. So it's good to document what those risk factors are, what proportion are obese, what proportion of children are undernourished, and what proportion of non-communicable diseases. And perhaps things like tobacco and alcohol could also be to looked at. That would actually help to then say, okay, what are the other additional facilities that could be put into those clinics? I mean, I think for women, reproductive health issues are very often the hidden issues which they don't talk about. whether it's sexually transmitted infections or other kind of reproductive health issues, having regular pap smears, for example, for cervical cancer. India has the largest number of deaths due to cervical cancer in the world, even though it's preventable by HPV vaccination. We're not doing that as yet as a policy. And the other approach could be really to, again, use digital tools. I mean, the community health workers who have tablets on whom they're actually regularly collecting information on all these families, so that you have a community that's being tracked, and that way you're also collecting a lot of data which will tell us over 5 years or 10 years what impact this has had. Is it something that should be scaled? For example, this experiment that you're doing in 15 villages. So empowering some of these community health workers with tablets where they're collecting some regular information, and then using specialists who could be connected through remotely now through telemedicine. I was on a panel with a young Pakistani woman doctor who started an NGO, basically because in Pakistan, women doctors, once they're married, are not allowed to work very often by their families. So a lot of women doctors are sitting at home. So she started this company, this enterprise where women doctors can actually give their services through telemedicine, where the health worker is actually sitting in a clinic with the patient, and the lady doctor is connected through like this and does the consultation, and then the healthcare worker probably does some of the actual physical checkups, as she's advising. So you don't even need now people to travel necessarily. You could connect with experts from Chennai, from Coimbatore, from any of the cities who provide that advice. So I think maybe a very good platform to test some of these innovative models, like the Arvind Eye Hospital does. Also, they have these franchises in many, many places where they have a health worker sitting with some basic equipment that they can check the patient. The doctors from the main Arvind Hospital are connected to give the advice. And then the optician sitting at the other end is actually delivering that advice. So maybe for ophthalmology, it's a very good model to scale, but we should try this for other chronic diseases as well. That's just a few questions.
For ophthalmology, we also have tied up with a local hospital, local NGO called Carnal, and
Okay.
we test the patients, and then if they have to have a cataract operation, we bring them at their cost, and in Karikudi, we do the cataract surgery. So also on health surveys, we do quite a lot of this health surveys, but now I think we should make it more intense. Thank you, Dr. Swaminathan.
Thank you, Dr. Mutha. Thank you, Dr. Swaminathan. This brings us to the last question for today, Dr. Swaminathan. You certainly are a great role model for aspiring youth of our nation, particularly women. What other qualities do you think are important for today's generations to be future leaders?
I think the most important one is to be passionate about whatever you're doing. Doesn't matter what the field is and what the discipline is. You should have that passion and interest to continue. Secondly, I think you should be a good observer and a good listener of people. It's not enough to just be good at your own work. You also need to listen and appreciate what other people are doing or saying. A third one is to have that humility always, to know that you can't know everything, that you have to also keep learning throughout your life. And then other, I guess, qualities like self-confidence and so on, that comes, with time, with opportunities, and with having the right mentorship, as we talked about earlier. It's important to have your goals, of course, in life, and what you want to do, what you want to achieve, not necessarily in terms of career. You can't always plan your career path, but you need to know what you want to achieve with the skill sets that you have and how you would like to use them. So that's what I would say really for young people. It's also much easier for them now to be connected, of course, and they are very connected and they live in a virtual world, but it also has its downside, I think, because young people are less likely to have the social contacts because of the virtual world they often tend to live in. And they're also very influenced, I think, by social media. And we know the role that these social media can play really on your mind without your realizing it. So that's something to be really watchful about, and to make sure that you have a balance between how much time you're in the virtual world and the real world.
Thank you very much, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan. It's been wonderful discussing with you on a variety of topics, and appreciate your patience in answering each one of our questions to the fullest extent possible.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Arun. It was really enjoyable. Thank you for
Friends, as a mark of our appreciation for Dr. Soumya Swaminathan spending her time with us, we would like to give her a memento. Just like how new SICKI 360 is, it being a new concept, we have also come up with a new concept for the guest memento. I'm sure most of you would be aware of the Kanchi Kamakoti Child's Trust Hospital in Chennai. This hospital has been in existence for several decades now, particularly contributing towards children coming from low-income families who have had several ailments. It has been brought to our notice that there is one infant boy who's been having a few ailments for which he needs expenses to be met, and his parents do not come from a well-to-do family. They are in the laborer category. So we have hence decided to contribute for this boy's medical expenses in the name of Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, and we will be making sure that this certificate reaches you at the earliest opportunity, Dr. Swaminathan.
Thank you so much. That's really a very nice gesture. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. In continuation of our discussion as well, we at SICKI would be very keen to continue working with the World Health Organization, identifying areas of mutual interest to society. In this context, we have come up with a concept called the Mind Gym project. All of us might be aware the World Mental Health Day is October 10th. Certainly, things like the pandemic, events like the pandemic rather, have disrupted and halted critical mental health services in most of the countries, and demand for this has hence been demand for such services has hence been increasing. This is according to a WHO survey dated October 5th. When we look at our country itself, last year we had close to 140,000 suicides. Tamil Nadu has been second after Maharashtra with over 13,000 suicides, and this is for the third year in a row. Mental disorders manifest itself during adulthood, whether it's depression or anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, and the like. It's perhaps higher in southern states of our country and compared to the less developed northern states. Tamil Nadu bears the impact of depressive disorders in India. Considering this, we were wanting to know what could be a possible solution. Towards that, SICKI decided on this Mind Gyms project that we plan to execute along with educational institutions and the government of Tamil Nadu. What's envisaged is a one-day training program that will be designed and delivered by our healthcare committee that is chaired by Dr. Balaji of Apollo Hospitals. And the intent of this would be to create awareness. Post this event, we hope to form a small team of mind warriors among the participants themselves, who would then further train their colleagues and be tasked with monitoring signs among their peers. This would ensure an early identification and necessary correction rather than having to face loss of lives. We certainly look forward to WHO's support or guidance in this initiative as we move forward. We would like to, before ending today's session, we would like to thank our advisors for today's session, Dr. A.C. Muthiah, our esteemed past president, as well as Mr. N. Ram. It is also necessary for me to appreciate the committee behind SICKI 360. It is chaired by Mrs. Valli Arun, who is the president of the Velingro Group and trustee of the Tamil Isai Sangam. The co-chair of this committee is Professor T. Murugavel, who is head of the Department Humanities and Social Sciences at SVC Chennai. Mr. Vinod Solomon and his active team, who've been running SICKI effectively the last few months. And I must appreciate them over the last week. This is the fourth program that we are conducting, which has attracted more than 100 audience. Mr. Gokul Santanam, Senior Vice President of Emphasis, and Mr. Amalan Alavandar, Environment Consultant at the Asian Development Bank. Friends, I would like to tell you that our next SICKI 360 session is again with another eminent guest, Dr. C. Rangarajan, whom all of you will be aware. He was the former Reserve Bank of India governor. He was also the former chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. He is currently the chairman of the Madras School of Economics. This event is scheduled for Thursday, the 5th of November, and it is going to be held in hybrid mode, which is both at SICKI's MAC Hall as well as online over WebEx as in today. This brings us to the end of today's session. We thank you very much for your participation today. We certainly look forward to your ongoing participation with us. Vanakkam, wishing you safe times ahead.
Thank you so much.